Dawn broke dimly over the frozen steppe, a dull grey light that flattened every shadow. It was late autumn 1942. Somewhere east of Kharkov, a single Soviet anti-tank gun crouched beside a battered farmhouse. The field was still glazed with frost, the earth too hard to dig deeper. Down the distant road, a column of German Panzers advanced in perfect order, armoured silhouettes framed against a low sun, exhaust plumes drifting like smoke from a furnace. The defenders had orders: hold fire until the lead tank crossed the culvert, then strike. But inside the gun pit, the lead gunner watched the pattern through his cracked sight. The column was tighter than usual. Trucks and half-tracks followed too close, the gunners exposed on top. He saw opportunity and danger. His commander whispered to wait. The gunner's hands trembled over the traverse wheel. One more second, he thought, and they'd all be gone. He disobeyed. The first round screamed down range, and history took a different course. That single defiant shot was not fired in isolation. It was part of a much larger struggle that defined the Eastern Front in 1942, a contest of speed versus endurance, armor versus discipline. By that year, the German army had already mastered the art of the armored march. After the lightning successes of 1941, panzer columns had become the iron spearhead of every advance. They rolled along Ukraine's open plains in columns of route, tanks leading, followed by half-tracks, supply trucks and recovery vehicles. Efficiency depended on tempo. If the lead vehicles slowed, the column choked. If one was destroyed, every engine behind it fell silent in confusion. The Soviets understood this pattern well. Their intelligence reports described snake roads of German armor moving without lateral spacing, ideal for air attack or ambush, disastrous if forced to halt. Yet for the defenders, stopping that mass of steel was rarely simple. Anti-tank guns were few, ammunition scarcer, and coordination often faltered under bombardment. Doctrine said to wait. Anti-tank teams were trained to hold fire until the leading tank entered a designated kill zone, often within 600 to 800 meters. The goal was precision, not volume. Strike the first vehicle to block the road, then the last to trap the column. Every shot had to count. Ammunition tables allowed only a handful of armor-piercing rounds per gun. Unauthorized fire, opening too early, wasting high-explosive shells, or firing without a command, was grounds for punishment. The gunner who broke that rule stood behind a 45mm 1937 gun, a weapon already considered light against the heavier German Panzer III and IV. Its tungsten-cored BR-240 AP rounds could penetrate roughly 40 mm of armor at 500 meters, but only if the angle was perfect. At greater distance or oblique hits, the shot might bounce harmlessly away. Most crews learned to hide their muzzle until the enemy closed, betting their lives on one or two clean penetrations. Around Kharkov, the front was fluid that autumn. Soviet rifle divisions were holding thin defensive lines, covering supply routes feeding the new Stalingrad front. German armored reconnaissance groups were probing for crossings and weak sectors. Villages changed hands overnight. Every farm, culvert or orchard edge became an improvised strongpoint. The fields were half frozen and filled with shell craters that glistened like mirrors. In such terrain, visibility was deceptive. At dawn, frost and diesel haze turned everything into silhouettes and movement. Range estimation became guesswork. The rule book could not anticipate every moment when hesitation might be fatal. To the west, German panzer formations moved under strict radio silence. Their orders emphasized momentum. Do not stop unless fire compels you. They trusted their armor and coordination to carry them through scattered resistance. Columns often combined tanks, engineers, and supply vehicles in one rolling line, efficient for logistics, but dangerously exposed if the first few vehicles were knocked out. For Soviet defenders, the enemy's strength was also his weakness. A blocked road could trap dozens of machines, ignite fuel trucks, and create an inferno visible for miles. The problem lay in timing. Opened too soon, and the column simply dispersed. Too late, and the Panzers would overrun the gun. That morning, the gunner's position covered a bend in the road, leading into a shallow depression. His crew had arrived the night before, exhausted and half frozen. They had stacked a few logs for camouflage and registered their range markers. The section leader had repeated the standing order: wait for the lead tank, confirm range, then fire. But by dawn the fog was thick and the sound reached before the shapes did. Through the scope, the gunner saw an alignment few ever witnessed. A tightly packed column, its command vehicle still midway down the slope. The rear was hidden by trees. If he waited for full visual confirmation, the first Panzers would pass the culvert, fanning out into open ground, and their machine guns would make any correction impossible. In that instant, doctrine collided with instinct. The decision to fire early violated training and regulation, but it exploited geometry. The depression meant that every vehicle behind the first would remain on the same line of sight. One round could range them all. The unauthorized shot was less about defiance than calculation, a split-second understanding of trajectory, distance, and panic. It was an act born not of impulse but of accumulated experience under impossible conditions, and as the shell roared out and the recoil slammed through the frozen ground, the Soviet defense of that sector entered a different chapter of the war, one that would soon draw the attention of both Army's field analysts. The story of that morning could not be understood without the machinery that fed it, the doctrines, the logistics, and the human fatigue behind the barrels. By 1942, the Red Army's anti-tank structure was stretched across thousands of kilometers of front. Each rifle division might possess a handful of light guns, some obsolete, some lacking proper sights. Ammunition came in irregular convoys. Crews sometimes received shells of mismatched lots, each with slightly different powder charges or penetrative performance. Under such conditions, doctrine was a shield against chaos. If every crew followed procedure, the front at least retained predictability. But doctrine had limits. The official manual instructed gunners to engage only at decisive range, defined as the distance at which the weapon could ensure penetration of the most common enemy tank. For the 45mm M1937, that meant roughly 500 meters for Panzer III. Closer to 300 for the newer Panzer IV with its thicker frontal plates. Beyond that, chance replaced calculation, yet battlefields were rarely ideal shooting ranges. Dust, fog, muzzle flash, and broken optics turned theory to hazard. Crews adapted or died. Some began using high-explosive rounds first, not for destruction, but for disruption. The concussion and dust blinded tank commanders, slowed the column, and exposed weaker side armor. It was a technique discouraged by manuals, but whispered about among veterans who had seen it work. This was not unique to the Eastern Front. British and American reports from North Africa described similar acts of initiative. Gunners who defied the wait for the lead order to exploit a fleeting angle. The Germans themselves, especially during the 1940 French campaign, had rewarded such flexibility. In theory, every army valued discipline. In practice, survival often depended on timing that no superior could foresee. The phrase unauthorized fire carried weight in all armies. It implied disobedience, a breakdown of command control. But within anti-tank crews, it also carried grudging respect. It meant someone had gambled with procedure to rescue the line. Logistics made those gambles costly. Each anti-tank gun was issued limited armor-piercing rounds, sometimes only 24. The rest were high-explosive or smoke shells, useful against trucks or infantry, but almost useless against thick armor. Crews were trained to count every AP shell as if it were gold. Firing even one without certainty could be treated as waste, a punishable act in the early years of the war. By late 1942, however, the Eastern Front had consumed too many men for formal punishment to matter. Commanders began to accept what German doctrine already acknowledged as Auftragstactic, mission command. It meant granting subordinates the freedom to act on intent rather than explicit order, provided the result advanced the mission. It was a philosophy built on trust, but in the Red Army's case, it emerged from necessity. The winter battles around Kharkov, Rzev, and the Donbassin tested that shift. German armored columns, still formidable, began encountering defenders who fired earlier, faster, and more unpredictably than before. Analysts later noted that Soviet gun crews were learning to read terrain like artillerymen, to judge when the landscape itself could trap armor more effectively than perfect accuracy ever could. In one declassified report from the Stalingrad sector, Soviet officers recorded a case where an anti-tank section initiated fire prematurely, contrary to command timing, yet destroyed 8 vehicles when the column halted behind burning wrecks. The report concluded tersely, result exceeds plan, initiative commendable. Such episodes mark the transition from rigid defense to adaptive warfare. They showed how battlefield innovation rarely began in staff rooms. It was born in frozen trenches, among men whose survival hinged on seconds. For the Germans, these moments were warning signs. Armored warfare depended on tempo. A single obstruction, one burning vehicle in the wrong place, could freeze an entire advance. When Soviet fire discipline became less predictable, Panzer commanders lost confidence in their pacing. Columns that once rolled at 25 kilometers per hour slowed to half that, fearful of unseen ambushes. The balance was shifting. By late 1942, German columns advancing toward the Don began encountering isolated guns, whose fire seemed erratic yet devastating. These were not wild shots. They were deliberate patterns designed to choke movement. The battlefield was evolving faster than the doctrines that governed it, and somewhere in that evolution stood the anonymous gunner near Kharkov, the man who had seen through the haze, ignored the order to wait, and turned his gun into a lever that stalled an entire armored thrust. What followed next was not chaos, but method, a calculated firing rhythm that would soon be studied by both sides in their post-action reviews. Tactical angle, every anti-tank action was a duel of geometry. A gunner's world narrowed to angles, ranges, and seconds. Standard Soviet doctrine in 1942 emphasized controlled salvos, one round for the lead, one for the tail, then measured retargeting to immobilize the column. What this gunner did instead broke the pattern. He fired continuously, not at specific vehicles, but along the column's axis, walking the fall of shot like artillery. The first high-explosive shell detonated short of the lead half-track, throwing earth and splinters into its viewports. The next, adjusted by instinct rather than order, landed amid the trucks carrying infantry. Dust and confusion erupted, blocking the road before armor could fan out. By abandoning the wait and strike rhythm, he traded precision for paralysis. Every vehicle behind the first stopped or swerved. Some slid into ditches. Within minutes, a disciplined German march dissolved into a traffic jam of engines and smoke. The tactic was crude but lethal. Shock first, accuracy second. In that frozen bend, control of tempo shifted from the armored column to a single field gun. Technological angle, the weapon was ordinary. A 45mm M1937 anti-tank gun weighing barely half a ton. Its sighting system, a simple telescopic optic with coarse range markings, demanded calm hands and practiced eyes. Against heavier panzers, its armor-piercing shell struggled, but the gun's traverse and elevation gears allowed quick correction, and its rate of fire could reach 15 rounds per minute. Most manuals warned against rapid fire, overheating warped the barrel and scattered accuracy. Yet in the cold morning air, metal contraction and frost worked in his favor. Each discharge cleared condensation from the chamber, and the recoil spades bit deeper into the frozen soil, keeping alignment steady. German observers later noted the distinctive alternation between high-explosive and armor-piercing rounds, an irregular pattern fire. By switching ammunition types mid-sequence, the gunner exploited the blast of one to mask the flash of the other. Through the smoke, the Panzers could not distinguish where the next impact would land. Technology's limits became its advantage when used with rhythm instead of regulation. Human angle inside the pit, noise consumed thought. Each shot slammed the body, rattling teeth, burning lungs with propellant fumes. The loader's gloves stuck to the frozen brass. The breech seared red. Orders faded beneath the roar. In such moments, doctrine dissolved into instinct born of repetition. The gunner's disobedience was not rebellion, but compression of experience, the memory of previous ambushes where hesitation had meant death. He had seen comrades wait for perfect range, only to be overrun by machine gun fire before pulling the lanyard. This time he acted first. Courage in battle often hides beneath routine gestures, a twist of the traverse wheel, a breath held through recoil, a silent calculation that no one else can see. What outsiders later called unauthorized fire was to the man behind the sight the only logical choice in a narrowing corridor of time. Fear became focus. Each shell was both survival and statement, a refusal to die by procedure. Enemy angle. From the German perspective, the incident appeared as an ambush that should not have existed. Their advance reports marked the road as cleared the night before. Reconnaissance had found no anti-tank positions, only abandoned trenches and livestock pens. When the first explosion tore the lead vehicle's track, the column commander assumed it was a mine. He ordered speed, not caution, a fatal reflex inherited from 100 victorious marches. The second detonation shattered that assumption. Dust blanketed the forward platoons, radios crackled with half-heard commands, and the disciplined formation crumpled into disarray. Tank commanders, blinded by smoke, began firing coaxial machine guns at imagined silhouettes, wasting ammunition and revealing positions. From a few hundred meters away, the gunner could see the pattern of confusion. Turret hatches slamming shut, engines revving in panic, trucks reversing into one another. The German column's precision, its greatest strength, became its cage. Within 7 minutes, mobility was lost. One unauthorized decision had done what minefields and artillery barrages often failed to achieve. Stillness. The battlefield now lay suspended between chaos and opportunity. A moment when the smoke cleared just enough for both sides to glimpse the new reality forming in front of them. Leadership and doctrine angle on paper. Battlefield command was supposed to flow downward in perfect order. Orders were issued, acknowledged, executed. But the Eastern Front rarely respected paper. Radios failed, lines were cut, and commanders often fought half-blind. In that fog, initiative became the currency of survival. Soviet doctrine in early 1942 still favored central control. Company commanders were to authorize all fire, and gunners were expected to obey range discipline. Yet by autumn, a quiet shift was underway. Reports from the Bryansk and Voronezh fronts began praising initiative at the gun line. The phrase po sobstvennomu resheniu, by personal decision, appeared in debriefs once punished by censure. Commanders had realized that waiting for permission could mean annihilation. The Kharkov gunner's case reflected this evolution. When his unauthorized pattern fire destroyed the column, senior officers faced a dilemma. Officially, he had disobeyed. Unofficially, he had executed what later doctrine would call mission command, understanding intent rather than awaiting order. In Western terms, this was Auftrags tactic, a German concept ironically mirrored by his Soviet defiance. Both philosophies recognized that no headquarters, however efficient, could dictate a gunner's split-second reality. The lesson written afterward was subtle but enduring. Initiative, when paired with competence, was not a threat to discipline, it was its highest expression. Moral and legal angle, the word unauthorized, carried moral weight long after the smoke cleared. Military systems rely on obedience. To disobey is to risk the integrity of the whole. Yet war often reduces ethics to survival's raw arithmetic. In many armies, including the Red Army, deliberate disobedience could mean court-martial or even execution. But context mattered. If the act produced victory, discipline could be quietly forgiven. History is filled with similar paradoxes. British tank commanders at El Alamein who fired smoke without clearance. German gunners at Kursk who ignored ceasefire orders when counterattacks threatened collapse. Each violated rule to preserve the unit. The Kharkov engagement entered reports as effective premature fire. The phrasing itself hid the moral tension, avoiding the word disobedience while acknowledging initiative. To the gunners' comrades, it was neither crime nor courage. It was necessity. They knew that rules written in calm headquarters could not predict the rhythm of panic in a frozen field. In later training manuals, the event was cited without names. Case study, early initiation of fire leading to column paralysis. No heroism, no sentiment, just data distilled from blood and instinct. It became one of many small episodes that slowly rewired Soviet command culture toward flexibility. The moral aftertaste lingered nonetheless. Every regulation depends on moments when someone chooses whether to follow it or not. In 1942, amid collapsing fronts and starving battalions, morality bent under the weight of survival. The Gunners' Act proved a truth as old as warfare. Obedience wins battles when the situation is known. Initiative wins when it isn't. By the time the last smoke drifted away, both sides were still counting the consequences. The physical wreckage could be measured. The deeper transformation could not. For the German column, it was tactical disaster. For the Soviet defense, it was the beginning of a doctrinal awakening. The next minutes on that frozen road would decide whether the victory held or whether German armor would recover and crush the isolated gun. The first impact stunned the column. A cloud of dirt and snow rose around the lead half-track as fragments clattered against armor plates. For a heartbeat, no one moved. The German commander raised his binoculars, searching for muzzle flash through the smoke. Then came the second blast, closer, heavier, and the road disappeared in dust. Inside the Soviet gun pit, rhythm replaced thought. The crew's motions became mechanical: fire, open breech, extract casing, reload. The loader's breath steamed against the breech block as he slammed another round into place. The gunner adjusted elevation by instinct alone. Through the optic, the range reticle danced amid smoke and chaos. He aimed not at tanks, but at shadows. The third shot was armor-piercing. It struck the lead half-track square in the glacis, punching through the thin frontal plate and igniting the engine compartment. The vehicle lurched sideways, blocking the ditch. Flames poured upward, black against the pale sky. The road, the artery of the column, was now sealed by wreckage. The gunner switched ammunition again. High explosive shells detonated in the convoy's center, showering splinters onto open trucks carrying ammunition crates. The Germans tried to reverse, but the road was too narrow. One driver panicked, steering off the verge. His truck overturned, spilling men and crates into the snow. Another vehicle rammed its rear, folding its bumper like paper. To the gunner, it was geometry unfolding exactly as imagined. The depression in the terrain forced the entire column to follow the same path. His line of fire, established by that first disobedient shot, intersected every vehicle in turn. Each round required only slight correction. He didn't see individual targets. He saw a moving formula of range and panic. Machine gun bursts cracked through the smoke as German tank commanders tried to suppress the unseen attacker. Bullets hissed over the trench, thudding into the log shield. The assistant gunner ducked instinctively, but the loader kept feeding shells. Their world had shrunk to the rhythm of recoil. At roughly 600 meters, a Panzer III emerged through the haze, its commander half exposed. The gunner switched back to armor-piercing, dialed one notch left for wind, and fired. The shell struck the lower hull, deflecting upward through the turret ring. The tank's hatch burst open in a plume of black smoke. A second Panzer halted behind it, trying to turn across the ditch and through a track. Its crew bailed out, diving for the roadside. Within 3 minutes, the narrow road became a graveyard of steel. Burning fuel streamed into the culvert, spreading fire along the ditch line. The air reeked of oil and cordite. Still, The gunner kept his sequence. He fired short, long, then centered, a pattern that mimicked a full battery's effect. German radio intercepts later misreported the ambush as multiple guns, perhaps even concealed artillery. In truth, it was one weapon, one mind repeating a cycle of controlled fury. To the German battalion commander, it looked like a trap sprung with surgical precision. He ordered flank reconnaissance, but the terrain was impassable. Thawing fields sucked at treads like quicksand. Engineers moved forward with explosive charges to clear wreckage, only to be cut down by a fresh salvo. The sound of the 45mm rapid discharge carried over the plain, echoing like drum beats of defiance. The Soviet crew's commander crouched beside the gunner, half shouting, half praying. They had violated orders in the most visible way possible, yet now there was no turning back. Ammunition crates were nearly empty. Only 6 rounds remained. But retreat meant exposure. They would fight until the column broke, or they did. The 5th armor-piercing round hit a tanker truck carrying fuel. The explosion rolled through the road like thunder. For seconds, visibility vanished completely. Flames climbed higher than the tree line. When the smoke cleared, the entire front of the column was burning. Behind it, the rest of the German formation halted in confusion. Radios crackled with conflicting instructions. Rückwärts! Vorwärts! Clear the road! The column's cohesion, its sacred tempo, disintegrated. Commanders shouted over engine roar. Gunners fired at random. Drivers reversed blindly into one another. In those moments, the gunner's unauthorized decision achieved what doctrine could not. He had turned a single defensive gun into a wedge that split the enemy's discipline. Every new detonation amplified the illusion of a larger ambush. From a hill, several hundred meters behind, Soviet observers watched the blaze and radioed division headquarters. Column halted, multiple vehicles aflame. No enemy advance. They didn't know the details, only that somewhere on that road, a single gunner had stopped a German armored battalion in its tracks, but the fight was not yet finished. Smoke and fire concealed as much danger as it created. Somewhere beyond the burning wrecks, surviving panzers were repositioning for retaliation. The next shots would decide whether the ambush ended in triumph or in annihilation. The roar of the burning tankers rolled across the valley like a storm. Flames bent sideways in the wind, and the air turned amber with drifting ash. The Soviet gun crew could no longer see the road. They fired by sound alone. Each new impact sent a concussion through the frozen soil. The gun carriage rocked, but held firm. From the German side, recovery vehicles began edging forward. Their crews were engineers, not fighters, men who carried cable and spanners, not rifles. Through the smoke, they could barely glimpse shapes, the silhouettes of toppled trucks and shattered half-tracks. The column commander barked into the radio for suppressive fire, ordering the panzers on the left flank to wheel off the road and bypass the wreckage. But the terrain that morning was no ally. The shoulders of the road were soft, thawing under the flames. When the first panzer tried to detour, its track broke through the crust and sank to the hub. Another followed and bogged down beside it. Engines strained, throwing fountains of mud that froze on contact with the cold air. The once precise German formation had become an armored maze. Inside the Soviet pit, ammunition dwindled. Only 2 armor-piercing and 3 high-explosive rounds remained. The crew chief wiped frost from his eyelashes and glanced toward the gunner. No words were needed. The next rounds had to count. The gunner chose a different rhythm now, slow, deliberate, waiting for movement. Through a gap in the smoke, he spotted a Panzer IV reversing, turret traversing toward their position. Its 75mm barrel glinted through haze. He adjusted 1 degree right, elevation down a hair, and fired. The first AP shell struck the ground just short, ricocheting into the lower hull. Sparks erupted. The second, fired seconds later, hit square at the driver's plate. A jet of flame burst from the vision slit. The tank lurched backward, engine dying mid-gear. That was the moment German fire found them. A shell whistled overhead and exploded behind the pit, showering the crew with dirt. Another struck close enough to tear open their camouflage net. The assistant gunner fell, dazed but alive. The commander shouted for withdrawal, but the gunner ignored him. There was one HE round left. He loaded it himself, shoulders shaking from exhaustion, and sent it into the middle of the road where the wrecked fuel truck still burned. The explosion was monstrous. Fuel vapor ignited into a rolling wave that consumed the nearest vehicles. For an instant, the battlefield glowed white. Then came silence, broken only by the crackle of burning metal. On the German radios, static replaced orders. The column commander realized the line was gone. He could neither advance nor retreat. His surviving tanks, scattered along ditches and fields, lacked line of sight to the enemy. To move meant exposure. To stay meant suffocation. He ordered ceasefire and regroup, a command that in the confusion few even heard. Across the slope, Soviet infantry sections that had been lying in cover began to rise. They advanced cautiously, rifles ready, moving between craters. The gun crew watched them through smoke as silhouettes took shape against the flames. Relief mingled with disbelief. They were still alive, and the Panzers were not. When reinforcements reached the gun position, they found the barrel blistered from heat, its paint peeled away. The breech smelled of burned oil and iron. Spent casings lay piled like brass cobblestones. Nearby, the loader sat slumped, hands bleeding from cold metal. The gunner himself remained at the site, motionless, staring down the same line he had. Fired through an hour earlier, German prisoners captured later. That day described the attack as artillery crossfire from multiple batteries. None believed a single 45mm gun had done it. They spoke of fire from the flanks, of mines, of hidden guns in the trees, fictions born of shock. But the field told the truth. One defensive pit, a ring of brass, and a charred line of vehicles stretching half a kilometer. By afternoon, the smoke drifted northward, revealing a road transformed into a metallic grave. 23 vehicles, tanks, half-tracks, fuel carriers, lay destroyed or abandoned. The column's timetable collapsed, its supply mission cancelled. What remained of the battalion withdrew at dusk, leaving wrecks to burn through the night. For the Soviet defenders, the silence that followed was heavier than the noise before it. No cheers, no declarations, only the understanding that their survival had hung on one decision. The commander finally approached the gunner, placed a hand on his shoulder, and muttered the only words that fit the moment. "You were not supposed to fire." But you were right. That night, as temperatures plunged again below freezing, the gun was dragged back for inspection. Technicians measured its warped barrel, noted the wear, and chalked a small mark on the trail, evidence for reports that would climb up the chain of command. Somewhere, staff officers would read about unauthorized initiation of fire, resulting in destruction of enemy column. No medals were requested. The gunner's name vanished into archives, yet on that frozen road, his defiance had altered the tempo of a war built on machines and orders. In breaking discipline, he had restored momentum to those who had none. The battlefield now stood quiet, but the consequences were just beginning to unfold, not only in wreckage, but in the minds of commanders who would rethink how initiative and obedience could coexist. When dawn returned the following day, the battlefield had frozen into stillness. The fires that had raged through the night were now reduced to faint smoke rising from twisted hulks. The snow around the road had melted into blackened mud, littered with metal shards, spent casings, and fragments of treads. Crows gathered early, circling above what had once been a precise German column. Field inspectors arrived by mid-morning. Their boots crunched over shell splinters as they counted the wrecks. An entire transport section destroyed, several Panzers immobilized or burned out. The lead half-track still smoldered where it had wedged itself against the ditch. The engineers estimated the road would remain impassable for at least 2 days. In an army built on tempo, 2 days were an eternity. To German staff officers, the report that followed was both brief and unsettling. It described unexpected and concentrated anti-tank fire from unknown positions, resulting in the destruction of multiple vehicles. No mention was made of a single gun. The language implied a coordinated ambush, perhaps even divisional artillery. The possibility that one crew could cause such paralysis was too improbable to document. For the Soviets, the aftermath was treated more quietly. The gunners' section had suffered one wounded man and a damaged weapon, but they had achieved what no defensive plan had predicted: the halting of an entire armored thrust with minimal support. The regimental after-action report used cautious phrasing. Initiative at the forward gun resulted in effective neutralization of enemy column. Beneath the words lay an acknowledgement rarely put on paper. Unauthorized action had saved the line. Operationally, the consequences were significant. The destroyed convoy had been carrying ammunition and fuel intended for forward Panzer units, supporting the winter push toward the Donets River. With the route blocked, fuel reserves dropped sharply, forcing several tank companies to curtail patrols for the next week. Supply officers logged the loss under enemy artillery interdiction. None suspected that the interdiction had been the work of a single field gun hidden beside a farmhouse. At higher command levels, analysts began comparing this and similar incidents from other sectors. They noticed a pattern: small anti-tank units firing early, disrupting entire mechanized movements before full contact was made. What had once been labeled recklessness began to look like a tactical evolution. Soviet field manuals would soon adopt a new phrasing: when range and concealment favor success, early fire is permissible. The sentence was buried deep in a training annex, but it marked a quiet revolution. For the Germans, the event became a cautionary note about overconfidence. After years of unchecked advances, they had begun to assume that any defense could be rolled aside by momentum. Now commanders were reminded that tempo without reconnaissance was a gamble. Following Kharkov, divisional orders stressed wider spacing in road columns and the immediate deployment of flank scouts in wooded terrain, changes designed to prevent another sudden paralysis. Back at the gun position, the weapon was hauled rearward for repair. Technicians cleaned the barrel, recorded the rifling wear, and painted over the scars. The gunner himself was reassigned to a training detachment 2 months later. Officially, he was experienced under combat conditions. Unofficially, he was the embodiment of a lesson that survival sometimes demands disobedience among his comrades. The story circulated in whispers, how one man's premature fire had destroyed more enemy vehicles than an entire battery. No medals, no ceremony, just respect spoken around campfires. Soldiers understood what headquarters rarely admitted, that war was not a formula, and those who lived longest were those who could read the moment when the rules stopped working. The road near Kharkov remained littered with wrecks for weeks. When thaw came, local villagers stripped the burnt vehicles for metal. The twisted remains of the first half-track were dragged aside only when spring rain turned the slope into a river of mud. But the tactical footprint of that day, the idea that one act of initiative could cripple a column, spread far beyond the village. By early 1943, it had already reached other fronts, shaping how anti-tank platoons would engage German armor in the critical months ahead. The event's material consequences were visible in steel and smoke, but its intellectual ones, in doctrine, mindset, and command culture, were just beginning to emerge. In the weeks that followed, the incident slipped quietly into the machinery of bureaucracy. Reports were typed on brittle paper, filed among thousands of similar engagements, and read by officers who measured success not in valor but in percentages of destroyed tonnage. Yet something in this report drew attention. It showed a small crew achieving disproportionate results, not through superior firepower but through initiative, that rare element no staff manual could manufacture. At the Soviet front headquarters, analysts reconstructed the event through fragments, range cards, surviving shell casings, aerial photographs. They noted the spread of impacts along the road, evenly spaced, as though plotted by a trained artillery observer rather than a single gun. They underlined one phrase from the field commander's note: "Firing commenced without authorization, but achieved decisive disruption." That line circulated quietly among training divisions, influencing the next generation of anti-tank instructions. By early 1943, revised directives on anti-tank ambush conduct appeared. They urged gun crews to exploit terrain geometry and, crucially, allowed early fire at opportunity targets when isolation made communication impossible. Officially, it was a clarification. In practice, it was an institutional admission that initiative could not be banned from the battlefield. German after-action reviews reached similar conclusions from the opposite side. The Kharkov report, when collated with others, demonstrated how even minimal defensive fire could paralyze an armored column if the first vehicle was destroyed in a choke point. Orders soon followed instructing units to maintain wider road intervals, disperse supply vehicles, and train drivers to bypass obstacles under fire. These were small tactical notes, but they reflected a shift in confidence, a recognition that absolute control of the battlefield was an illusion. Historians later found that such micro-incidents often shaped doctrine more profoundly than grand offensives. They taught commanders humility, that a single unpredicted act could reset an entire sector's rhythm. In that sense, the Kharkov gunners' disobedience was not an anomaly, but a glimpse of the future. The late-war Red Army would thrive on decentralized action, from tank brigades to infantry squads, each entrusted with fragments of command intent. What began as unauthorized fire evolved into formal mission command. For those who survived that winter, the memory remained less theoretical. Veterans of the gun line recalled the smell of burned oil, the metallic taste of snow laced with cordite. They remembered not doctrine, but the silence after the last shot, the disbelief that one small weapon could silence an armored column. After the war, when Soviet archives compiled the statistical histories of units, the engagement appeared only as a single line in a divisional summary. Enemy convoy destroyed on road east of Kharkov. 45mm battery engaged successfully. No names, no decoration lists, no citation. But inside the professional military academies, the scenario lived on as a case study, an example of decisive action under uncertain command. Cadets analyzed firing angles, ammunition selection, and psychological impact, rarely realizing that behind the numbers lay one man's moment of instinct. For the Germans, the lesson was equally stark. The event joined a growing collection of warning signs that the Soviet defense was no longer rigid or predictable. Gone were the days when Red Army units waited passively to die by the book. The enemy was learning faster than anticipated. By the end of 1942, those lessons had already manifested on larger scales at Stalingrad, where initiative among isolated Soviet units turned pockets of resistance into walls of attrition. The Kharkov Gunners Act was a single note in that wider transformation, the sound of doctrine cracking open to admit human judgment. And in the quiet that followed, commanders on both sides understood that the battle for control was no longer just about machines or territory. It was about time, who seized it first and who hesitated. The guns would fall silent. But the question his act raised, about the thin line between discipline and initiative, would linger across generations of soldiers. War often remembers its grand offensives, its marshals and maps, but history moves just as decisively in the quiet spaces, the moment a single soldier chooses instinct over order. The frozen road near Kharkov was one of those spaces. There, a lone gunner measured his world in seconds and distance, not ideology, and in doing so exposed the paradox at the heart of all military discipline. Armies must function on obedience, yet survival demands initiative. The line between the two is drawn and erased by every shot fired in combat. The Kharkov gunner crossed it not for glory, but for geometry, a calculation that saved a regiment and crippled a column. His act remains anonymous, but the echo of his decision traveled farther than the shell he fired. Modern doctrine, with its careful balance of command and autonomy, owes much to such forgotten moments. Every manual that encourages subordinates to act in accordance with intent, rather than wait for explicit orders, carries a fragment of that winter morning's lesson. In an age of machines and networks, the truth endures. The battlefield will always reduce itself to individuals who decide faster than the situation can collapse. For historians, the engagement near Kharkov is a minor footnote, a small incident among millions. But to those who study warfare as a human endeavor, it remains a parable of judgment under pressure. It reminds us that courage is not always loud, and defiance is not always rebellion. Sometimes history advances because someone dared to act when the rulebook said wait, and somewhere beneath the frost and wreckage of that forgotten road, the imprint of a gun's recoil still marks the earth, a silent testament to the moment one man's unauthorized fire changed the pace of a war built on order.